Hello everybody and welcome to Mr. Stansfield's education videos. Today we're talking about film cameras. And we are going to take a look at a couple of the film cameras I have with me here. We are going to be talking about just the absolute basics. And often what we do is pare down exposure, or the correct exposure, the correct amount of light that comes into a camera. We pare it down to three elements that make up what we call the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is made up of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now on a film camera, ISO is in some ways the easiest because for each roll of film that you're shooting, your ISO will be constant. It's not going to change. In digital photography, you can change your ISO from one picture to the next. But because ISO, what ISO is, it's the rated sensitivity of the film. And one analogy that I like to use to describe ISO is that, ISO is how sensitive film is to light. And one of the ways that I like to think about this is that different people have different sensitivities to sunlight when we go outside on a bright sunny day in the summertime. Some folks can go outside and they don't put on sunscreen and they're outside for an hour or two and they won't burn. And their skin is visually unaffected. Maybe they're getting cancer and all that. That's not what we're talking about here. But some folks can go outside for several hours, let's say, and their skin is less sensitive to sunlight. Some folks go outside for 10 minutes and they get burnt, and those folks' skin is more sensitive. So it's a similar kind of thing. Different films are more or less sensitive to light. That is the ISO rating of the film. Now typically most photographers shoot anywhere from like 100 to, let's say, really 400. Sometimes you'll see ISOs that are significantly lower and significantly higher, but for the most part, most photographers will shoot, especially at photo 1, we're going to be shooting with ISO 400 speed film. And so ISO 400 film is sort of an average sensitivity. And so that's element 1. Now let's take a look at a couple of these cameras here and talk about how to set the ISO. And let's start with what is probably one of the easier cameras to have your ISO set your ISO. These cameras, like this Nikon N60 or a Canon Rebel, something like that, these cameras will automatically set the ISO when you put it in. Modern film canisters have a actually design printed on the camera, on the canister rather, of film that the camera can read, and the camera automatically sets the ISO. Now you can override that, and there are reasons why you might want to do that. Explore that later down the road. But knowing how to override it for the sole reason on your particular camera. So if this is your camera, a Nikon N60, Google ISO override or ISO manually set on Nikon N60. You want to know how to do that so that if it's accidentally turned on, if that ISO override is accidentally turned on, you know how to turn it off so that it automatically reads the ISO. That's going to be the easiest way. You put the film in and close the back of the camera, and it's going to automatically advance the film and it's going to automatically read the ISO. Older mechanical cameras like this K1000 Pentax camera, if you look here on the top dial, typically there is a dial either here or sometimes over here on the left. I'm going to look at a camera that has the ISO on the left in just a moment. Over here you can see there's a little teeny window, and I'll see how close I can get. There it is, ISO, and you can see it says ISO 200. All right, now this ISO setting, actually let me turn it this way. And let's see if I can get some focus here. Here it is. ISO 200. And what you do is, this little window is the ISO reading. You can take the outside ring and pull it up. And each camera is slightly different. This is the K1000 that I have. We're going to pull this up, rotate the outside dial, and set it to your ISO, which is now 400. That's typically, like I said, what we're going to use. I'm going to try to line that up. There it is, 400. Right? So lift up. Try not to get in the way here. Lift up. And then you can see that that number rotates inside the window there. Okay. So that's going to be how to set the ISO in this K1000. Over here, this is a Nikon Fg, which is another older mechanical camera, I think from the 80s or so. And over here on the left side of the camera, we're holding it like so. On the left side, you can see it's actually pretty similar. There's an outside ring that you lift up and rotate, and there's a little red dot, as I'll show you here. There is a little red dot right here that lines up with the ISO, and you can see all of the ISOs are listed there. This one goes from 12 to 3200. And typically you're going to be shooting with 100 or 400, and if you look carefully here, you'll see that 100 and 400 are both red. So that tells you that it is actually, those are common ISOs. All right. So set the ISO when you load the film in the camera, and then you can kind of forget about it until you shoot your next roll of film. It's something you want to do when you load the film, and then you don't really have to worry about it after that. The other two settings on the camera are shutter speed and aperture. Now both of these are a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to make separate videos for each of those two things. As well as the light meter, which is really the fundamental way that we're going to be making sure that our pictures are correctly exposed or have the right amount of light coming into the camera. Exposure, if you have a one-word synonym for exposure in photography, it's going to be light. Photography can't happen without it, so you got to have the right amount of light coming into the camera, hitting the film, and making the exposure. Well, how do you balance the light that's coming in and hitting the film? You use shutter speed and aperture. How do you know which shutter speeds and apertures to use? You rely on your light meter. So we'll talk about those things in separate videos.